Hey y'all, it's Nefertiti the Corny Rainbow, and I've been away for a few weeks. I've been super busy, but I've been sewing up a lot of projects for the holiday season. One being my favorite fabric, which is sequins fabric. I know you want to get all your sparkle and shine things made for Christmas and New Year's, and I'm going to be sharing with you some tips on how to sew with sequins. And this is also beginner friendly. Today I'm going to be showing y'all how I sew sequins for the holiday season. And I'm going to be sharing some beginner friendly tips that make working with sequins fabric that much easier. Let's get into it. So I got notes. If you see behind me, I have finished sewing up my sequins blouse, and I'm so in love with this blouse, y'all. So I'm going to be sharing with y'all the construction of this particular blouse and what I did to create it. And while I was sewing it up, because I haven't sewn with sequins in so long, I was like, I need to talk about this. And I am an avid sequins sewist. So this is not my first rodeo. I've been sewing sequins for years and years, and I've always loved it. But I found tips on sewing it, making it a lot easier so that I'm breaking less needles and just making it easier on myself so that I continue to want to sew up my favorite type of fabric. I mean, look at it. It's shiny, it's sparkly, and y'all, hello, it's perfect for the season. Just jumping right into my first tip is needles. Okay. Now, this is the most important tip for sewing with sequins, because the needle that you use on your machine while sewing with sequins needs to be extremely sharp. My preferred needle is a ballpoint or Microtex, like super sharp needle. And I always use brand new needles when I'm working on a new sequins project. By doing this, you're going to cut down on the needles breaking, missing stitches because the needle is not sharp enough. The list goes on. A lot of times people get frustrated sewing with sequins because they're afraid the needles are going to pop. Now, I ain't gonna lie, y'all, the needles still sometimes break, and it could just be that you went over too much sequins at once, or you didn't remove the sequins from the seam allowance, which is another tip that I'm going to get to in a little bit. So make sure you're choosing the right needle. A brand new ballpoint Microtex super sharp needle will do the job. The universal needles are not going to cut it. All right. You don't want the needle to be dull, and that's usually the reason why you skip stitches. A ballpoint needle is going to really push through the fabric. It's sharp, it's gentle, and you won't have the risk of them breaking. When in doubt, just start with a fresh needle. Okay. The next tip is when I choose hand sewing sequins versus machine sewing sequins. There's multiple layers to this tip, and the first layer being sometimes I'll run pieces through the machine, but there are areas like necklines, hems, and seams with heavy sequins clusters where hand sewing is safer. My rule of thumb is if I cannot avoid the sequins fabric being on the bottom of my foot, on the underside of my presser foot, then I will usually hand sew that area. So say for instance, you're closing up like a cuff on this shirt. The cuffs on this shirt, you have to stitch in the ditch sometimes, or, you're putting right sides together with the inside, but you're going to top stitch. I would avoid sewing that on the machine, and I would just hand sew it. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that because they're like, I don't want to hand sew. It's going to take too long. But you're going to get a much cleaner look, and you're risking popping the needles on purpose because it's going to have a hard time feeding through your machine. Needles also pop because you're not removing the sequins. So depending on how large the sequence is on your fabric, you may or may not need to remove the sequins. And that's another tip. So if your machine is struggling and making those loud crunchy noises, switch to hand sewing, okay? And save your sanity, for real. Trust me on this one. So this is a tip that I use on this particular blouse, and my pattern didn't call for stretch fabric. So I already had this stretch sequins fabric on hand and I wanted to use it. I needed this specific color in gold, and I said, I'm still going to use it. So I don't want the stretch. So what do? You add a faux lining to the sequins. And what I mean by that is sometimes I will sandwich like a satin or a not too thin lining fabric, but something like a thicker satin fabric. And I will put it on the inside of the sequins. I'll still cut the same amount of pattern pieces of the sequins, but I will then add a lining if the pattern doesn't already call for a lining. So this particular pattern does not call for a lining, and it is a McCall's blouse pattern. It didn't call for a lining. It does have front facing and the facing in the back of the collar, and then also in the back of the blouse. So in those areas I added lining instead because I didn't want the sequins rubbing up on the inside of my skin. So just keep that in mind when you're sewing with sequins. If it's not a smooth sequence, it's like soft, which most of them aren't, this one is not too bad. Like probably one of the best sequins fabrics that I've had in a long time. And it was gifted to me from Atlanta Frocktails years ago, like one of their first Frocktails by Nikki Griffin. Hands down, one of my favorite sequins fabrics to sew with because it's soft and it's also soft on the skin. So you're not worrying about getting cut by the sequins if it does happen to graze up against your skin. The satin will give it stability and structure. And I didn't even need to interface a few of the pieces because I double layered the pattern pieces with the satin. This is a great trick if your sequins are stretchy but your pattern is not. So the next tip is working without interfacing. With sequins, because some of them are a little see-through, you may not want to use the interfacing. Interfacing comes in black, white. I don't know if it comes in other colors. The only colors that I've ever had is black and white. But sometimes that white is a little too harsh if your sequins fabric is already a little see-through. So my option for avoiding that is to just use a color underneath it that balances or is within your sequins fabric already. So in this case, mine is gold. So I already had like some gold bronze type fabric that I used as the lining, and or my faux lining is what I call it. It's still a lining, technically, is just the inside seams are a little bit different than a traditional lining inside of a dress or garment. That satin layer will act like a built-in stabilizer. It's thicker than the interfacing, so I'm pretty much still getting an interfacing feel, if not something better. So just keep that in mind. Tip number 5 is a quick look at my sketch, because I do suggest sketching out or prepping for your projects, not just for sequins, but just for all of your sewing projects, because sometimes you may not be able to visualize how it's going to come together. So for this particular look, I was doing a mommy and me look for me and my daughter, and we were going to be taking Christmas photos, and we don't have any Christmas style clothes that we match. So I also made sequins pants for my baby girl and a bow that she was able to wear in her hair in the other color that we wore, which was green. So obviously this is a holiday theme video, so I'm gonna be talking a lot about the holidays because I feel like that's the time where I wear sequins the most, during the holiday season. Year round it gets worn, but really heavy during Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the New Year. Like, all the sequins comes out. I had another choice for this particular sequins fabric, and it was a button down shirt. Now, again, one of my tips is I try to avoid removing sequins from the fabric, but I'm not opposed to doing it. I would only remove the sequins from fabric, the sequins fabric, if the sequence is large. So on larger scale sequence fabrics, I almost always remove the seam allowance before I even sew, because no matter how thick my needle is, once that seam allowance is folded towards the inside of my skin, I don't want to feel the sequence that I cut down to cut out the pattern piece scratching up against me. And if you've ever done that, then it is not comfortable, and one little piece can literally take you out. So take my advice, and if you're using larger sequins, then cut the sequins out, the seam allowance. Don't miss that step. Like, always do it. In this case, I did not have to do it because, again, the sequence is so soft and flowy, and it is a stretch sequence fabric. I didn't have to do that, which made this project even that more easier. Another tip that I have is using heavier thread. Okay, if your needle is a top stitch needle, then the actual eye of the needle is going to be larger, and you can fit thicker thread through that needle for that reason. So when I'm sewing sequins, because you are hand sewing a lot, regular old polyester thread weight is not gonna cut it. And especially if you've cut your sequence fabric out, your pattern pieces, it can snag against that thread. And if that thread is not thick enough, it's gonna 9 times out of 10 pop. So if you're experiencing a lot of popping of your thread, even on your sewing machine and not just with your hand sewing, you probably want to get a heavier weight of thread. You want to make sure that you're not using a thread that is stretch. So avoid any stretch threads, and you can use an all-purpose polyester, but my suggestion would be to use a heavier duty polyester thread. And you'll see me here hand sewing and really tugging with that needle, because I'm trying to hurry up and sew it up together. And once you have to do a hand sewing over and over on a garment, you are really trying to get it done. I don't mind hand sewing, actually like hand sewing, but if my thread is popping on my fabric while I'm hand sewing, it is not fun, y'all. So use a stronger tensile strength. It'll pull through the fabric better. The better you'll have better durability in your seams, and they won't need extra reinforcement. Less breakage when you're sewing through thick clusters of sequins. Some heavy threads that work best for sequins are going to be your Tex 30 or Tex 40 polyester thread. That garment may look lightweight, but it is actually pretty heavy, and that is because it's sturdy. It has the extra lining. I also added some bias bonding on a few of the seam allowances where it needed to be finished on the inside. Gutermann is my favorite brand. No, I'm not sponsored. I wish I was. I love Gutermann, but my machine can only handle Gutermann thread and a few other high quality threads. When I try to use other brands like Coates and Clark's on my Bernina machine, it does not like it, y'all, and it's a problem. My machine is very bougie, and yeah, I don't like dealing with threads popping while I'm sewing because that will slow me down and it will make me frustrated. Important thing is to match the thread to the needle. Since the thread is heavier, using a ballpoint needle again is going to be your best bet. So for regular sequins, my ballpoint needle that I would use would be my 80/12 or my 90/14. And for heavyweight thread, I would use a ballpoint 90/14. The next tip that I have, so in this blouse, I added bias binding to the front facing and also the back facing of the blouse. And because I'm not going to I didn't use my serger to finish off the raw edges, I couldn't just do a narrow hem and then risk having it scratching up against my chest and feeling uncomfortable. So I added bias binding. So get creative with how you're creating the inside, and also think about how the garment is going to fit on your body. So if this was a looser fit sequence project, then I probably wouldn't have been so in detail about adding the bias binding and making sure that it wasn't rubbing up against my skin, because it will be a loose fit garment. But because this is a tight fit garment and it's in my bust and back area, and I don't want the sequin scratching me. So how did I prevent that? For the front waistband piece, you can see here, I didn't use sequins on the inside of that garment at all. The pattern did call for me to use sequins on the inside. The same fabric that I would use on the outside, I would use on the inside. But instead, I used one piece for the front and I used the satin for the inside. Why? So that the satin would be what I feel. And then I still did my understitching and the same exact thing for the rest of the tie. So the tie goes all the way around to the back, and I can show you guys the back. So you can see that the tie crisscrosses in the back, and then this is my bias binding, and this is the back facing of the garment. My last two tips are strictly about safety. So when I first started sewing with sequins, I just out of reaction would always be nervous when I would go over thick sequins if I didn't remove it. So I've learned, and I do better, where I actually just take the time and remove it. Patience. You have to have patience when you're sewing with sequins, because you are not going to rush through this project. If you are, you're going to risk breaking needles and starting the seam over, or just hand sewing it in the first place. So patience, very important. Hear me when I say this. Your arm strength and how you wind that sewing machine is going to come in handy when you're sewing sequins. I can't tell y'all how many times I had to wind because I didn't want to press on my pedal to go. Because it may have risked me breaking a needle. So when you're going over the seam allowance that may be a little thicker than you think, hand wind it. Always hand wind it. Don't try to speed through it. Again, that goes back to the patience. Hand winding, patience, and protective gear if necessary. So I wear glasses, and those fall under the category of protective gear, because when I tell y'all, these needles break and sometimes they be flying. So when that happens back in the day, I would get so scared, y'all. Like anytime that needle would break, I would just jump. So it's like my natural reaction to jump when the needle would break. So if you're already feeling like you may be a jumper, wear some type of protective eyewear so that you don't risk the needle probably flying in your eye or, anywhere else. So that is it I hope that you enjoyed these tips on sewing with sequins and that you feel a little bit more confident sewing sequins for the holiday season. If you want more tutorials like this, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to get tips on next. Thank y'all so much for tuning in with me, and I'll see you on the next one.